myself without you. With you, I get.
Jesus has ascended to heaven. Paul has been converted and is in his ministry. And so today we study Paul's letter to the church at Rome. Largely a Gentile audience, we need to put it in its context. The Roman Empire was known for its brutality against the powerless and the persecution of Jews, as well as anyone in the Christian church. Idolatry was widespread when Paul was writing this letter, and emperor worship was common. Paul is writing this letter in a context that's rather oppressive to Christians. And so when he writes it, he is saying to them that the basic reality of God is plain and clear. He points to creation in its beauty, its power, complexity, and harmony, and says that that shows clear evidence of God. People have always been able to see God, he notes, and there is no good excuse for denial and the creation of a false God. You see, the Christians at this point in Rome were under pressure from society and from the government to adopt the idols and to worship the emperor. And so Paul is trying to reinforce this church. He says that man's proper response to the revelations of God should be to worship and to gratefully acknowledge God. But they're in Rome. Rome is ruled by men of power, of lust, men filled with sin, and man's response to the revelation of God was first rejection. And Paul said they suppressed the truth that they could clearly see with unrighteousness. The people knew God, but they did not treat him like God. They refused to worship him. The government wanted them to worship the emperor who had declared himself a god. Society pressured them to trade their God, the one true God who made the universe, for cheap figurines that you could buy along a roadside stand. Instead of worshiping the God who made man in his own image, they made a God in an image that only they could imagine and then began to worship him. They worshiped the created rather than the creator. In essence, they remade a God so that they could be in control of what was right and what was wrong in their society. Before we quickly say, well, we don't do that, as modern Christians, we may not out and out reject God, but we must be cautious that we do not reshape God's words and our understanding of God's will so that we can claim that we are doing what God has asked us to do. Paul stressed that we must not be foolish and conceive things in our own minds. We must seek the truth according to God's divine word and his will. Remember, the powers of Rome disliked Christians because they stood up against the emperor worship and the idol worship and the perversion of society. Christians threatened Rome, and so Rome threatened Christians. And with that context, Paul wanted the church to focus on the truth, Christian doctrine, and not let Roman society reshape their values. When we reshape God's will, his teaching, his love, so that we can match popular opinion, so that we can fit into the rest of society, we are remaking God in our own designer image. We're making a false God. Next, Paul reminds us that the wrath of God is not merely something in the future, it is also in the present. He says what my grandmother used to say, and that is, you made your bed, now you have to lay in it. Paul points out that idolatry and immorality is itself a punishment for the sin of idolatry and immorality. Enduring the sin itself is a punishment. Paul writes that God abandoned them to their foolish thinking and let them do things that should never be done. Look at our world. The sin of unbelief results in the sin of immorality. And without change, more unbelief and more immorality will only be followed by more unbelief and more immorality. The only cure is a revival, a conversion. Let's give an example. We hear the songs with words that assault our hearing, blasting from cars blocks away. Allowing those immoral words to come out and pollute the atmosphere only leads to new words and new ways to assault our sense of decency. TV shows now that use these words, web pages that use these words, candidates that run for office use these words. We sink into a sinful cesspool. Only a revival, a change of heart, will change society. Paul says to them and us that we religiously devolve, we get worse. With the removal of God's hands, acting on our own, on their own, Roman society got worse. They had depraved minds. They did what they ought not to do. They were filled with every kind of wicked, evil, greedy depravity. They were full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, and malice. They gossiped and they slandered. As modern day Christians, we must place priorities on God's values and not on worldly values, or else our sin will be our own punishment, and ignoring God's plain truth costs. That's the lesson for this week. You all have a great week. Bye.
The soul could have saved me. I feel you in every heart.